But there's this terminology, neo-colonialism, that we hear a lot. And most recently, President William Ruto has really come out to talk about the international financial architecture. When the UN Secretary General was in Kenya, he did talk about when the Bretton Woods institutions were being created, Africa was not at the table. Even if we look further at the United Nations Security Council, and that's a conversation we'll get to, Africa is not represented. Are we victims? Do we remain victims even 60 years after the establishment of the African Union, the OAU then? Do we remain, in your view, in some aspects, and perhaps let's limit it to financially, colonized?
Thank you very much, Olive, and I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yeah, yes, very clearly.
I think that is a very tired narrative. This narrative that Africa is financially colonized, etc. It's a very tired narrative. Shouldn't we be building and creating new narratives? I have a tremendous sense of optimism about the future of the continent, and it all depends on what we want to see. And so perhaps just to share with you, I think 2 years ago, while I was still at the APRM, the African Peer Review Mechanism, we produced a report on governance that was looking at governance futures, and the idea was you build the future you want through creating the right institutions, investing in the right institutions, so to speak. So the scenarios that we were looking at would tell us, for example, that Africa could disintegrate or Africa could unite. And so if we want to avoid Africa disintegrating, there are a number of things that we need to do. And Africa also has the youngest population in terms of it's the so-called African youth dividend. And that puts it, in terms of the future, at an advantage, at a great advantage compared to all the other continents. And so the question then becomes, how do we take advantage of Africa's youth dividend, and how do we deploy technology in that respect as well? And of course that implicates how we govern ourselves. So the challenge for me is the disconnect that I see between the African Union or its institutions and the citizens. Just the same way that democracy has been captured at the national level, I see a sense in which democracy has also been captured at the continental level. So the AU is in many ways removed from the citizens. They don't quite identify with it. So the question then becomes, or the task then becomes, one of bringing the citizens and the African Union institutions together so that we build a desirable future that can allow Africa to take advantage of its youth dividend and the possibilities of technology that today exist. And certainly if you were to ask Nkrumah and his colleagues, I would think that they would be happy about what has happened, particularly since the year 2000. Because I travel quite a lot across the African continent, and I see tremendous change in terms of how Africans govern themselves, particularly in terms of how citizens demand for good governance. So it's a question of ensuring that the demands of the citizens are met, not just at the national level, but at the regional level, at the level of the African Union. So the next task has to become one of democratizing the African Union so that as citizens we connect better with it.
Okay. democratizing the African Union. Dr. Edgar, Professor Migai takes the view that this whole neocolonialism narrative is tired. But we have heard the president, the IMF chief, the UN Secretary General say that we are at a disadvantage.
Yeah, thanks, Olive. From where I sit, even though Prof, and I respectfully listen to his view, even though he says it is a tired narrative, it is still a relevant narrative. We cannot ignore it. The truth in Africa is that neocolonialism, as it is structured, you have these dotted chains, this dotted line, where we have former colonial masters still quietly whispering to African governments about particular issues, like trade issues. And allow me to go back into history, and if we step on people's toes, we want, it's for academic debate. Some time back when I was young, you found that in Kenya, all our military equipment came from a particular region. Certain contracts were like locked, and certain countries had to provide them. But when President Kibaki came into power, I remember he decided to say, you know what, we're not going to buy equipment from this side, we're going to turn east, trying to break off those shackles of neocolonialism. Neocolonialism exists in Africa because if we turn to countries like West Africa, without naming countries, going too deep, we know the powers that have been in control of West Africa, the French, for the longest time. And those economies could not run without the French, quote unquote, interfering or offering advice or highly advising, highly telling those governments how to behave. So neocolonialism is not a tired narrative. If we are able to break off these shackles of neocolonialism, I believe Africa will begin to move forward. What the president was trying to say in his most recent speeches that have garnered a lot of interest was trying to tell the world, give us some space. We have something to contribute on the table. Africa is, we are awake. We have woken up and smelt the coffee, as the saying goes. And we are ready to contribute as equal partners. Neocolonialism is still a stumbling block. It is big because from all these institutions that control finances, from trade, Africa is treated as a peripheral partner. So the renaissance that you're hearing, the voice that you're hearing, the clarion call that you're hearing is bring back Africa to the table because we deserve that slot. Yeah, so neocolonialism for me is not a tired narrative. It is something that we have to confront. It's something that we have to engage, continuously relook at, and try and fight for that space until we are able to break off those shackles. Now, the flip side of the coin is African leaders have got to be willing to bite the bullet and take that risk. What the president did, he said that he went out on a limb and actually said a lot of things that of course got the world rattled and some people saying, oh my God, now what has he done? But that's the kind of noise we need to hear being generated in Africa. Most African presidents need to stop being afraid, say the truth. They are the wearers of the shoe. They know where it pinches. The president said his part. Other African leaders need to come and say, you know what, we do not like this. It should not be business as usual. And for me, neocolonialism is the first thing we need to start tackling. So it is a relevant debate. It is not dead.
It is not a tired
narrative.